Greetings, science fiction and fantasy enthusiasts. Do you read books? Do you watch films? Do you hate deodorant? Then welcome to our podcast. You're listening to No Deodorant in Outer Space with Ryan Sean O'Reilly. Now, let's get started.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to the Season 4 conclusion episode of No Deodorant in Outer Space. My name is Ryan Sean O'Reilly. My dear guests and co-hosts, and contributors and co-conspirators, also my good fans and detractors, who I welcomed back at the start of this year. I've now completed the 4th season of the podcast. I hope you all enjoyed yourselves as much as I did. I shall not keep us too long this evening, for I recorded this episode for a purpose. Indeed, for 3 purposes. First, to tell you all that 4 seasons is too short a time to podcast with such excellent and admirable contributors. I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. Secondly, I want to celebrate the completion of the 4th season of No Deodorant in Outer Space by briefly reflecting on the catalog of stories we covered this year. So let me just go through a quick survey of the various topics that we covered, which included a graphic novel, a tale of young adult coming-of-age story, a fantasy, science fiction, philosophical, speculative fiction. We ran the gamut on the show, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and we even revisited authors that we had covered previously, and we explored new ones. So it was a very well-rounded season for us. Our first episode in January, we covered Altered States, written by Paddy Chayefsky, and the movie directed by Ken Russell, which starred William Hurt. In that episode, we welcomed back Wilk to the microphone and added another member of the metal group I Decline to our repertoire, Dustin. This was a strange affair, as we revisited the controversial director Ken Russell, and in this episode, he fared much better overall than he did when we covered him in Lair of the White Worm on a previous season. This was in contrast to the screenwriter-turned-novelist, whose prose came across as overburdened and unnecessarily technical, despite his short but illustrious career, that being Paddy Chayefsky. In February, actually at the suggestion of a fan some time ago, we covered Never Let Me Go, written by Kazuo Ishiguro, and the film of the same name, directed by Mark Romanek, which starred, among others, Keira Knightley. We recorded this episode in a skyscraper overlooking a city night in Chicago, with traffic lulling in the background. We also invited back musician Dan Gonzalez, who was joined by my cousin, Margaret O'Reilly, who has served as the voiceover since Season 2 of the podcast. During our recording, we dove into the psychological underpinnings of the Japanese philosophies behind some of the character sentiment and mood in both the book and the movie, and we discussed how the movie complemented the melancholy and understated science fiction theme explored in the novel. Another thing we got into is how we all came to it expecting something more bombastic, but we've ended up feeling that the slow, burning originality in the novel left us more thoughtful upon further reflection. Our third episode, we covered the writer Charles Beaumont, who contributed a lot to the classic science fiction show Twilight Zone by Rod Serling. On this episode, I was joined by a returning guest and my cousin Mike O'Reilly, along with my other cousin and his sister Kaylin O'Reilly, who's a book reviewer herself, and Mike's friend Andreas, who's an oil painter as well as an up-and-coming indie director, like Mike. These episodes were just plain fun. We recorded them in between lectures and screenings at the Wildwood Film Festival that's held in Appleton, Wisconsin, where Mike was exhibiting one of his short pieces. We had a lot of good energy going on since we were on location, and plus everyone was a big fan of this iconic television series. We all appreciated taking a singular look at the show through the eyes of one of its lesser-known but memorable writers. The whole crew, all 4 of us, enjoyed the stories and appreciated their adaptations for television. Both the author's short-lived life and that of the Twilight Zone's host were also very fascinating. While perhaps nobody was blown away, we all had a blast revisiting the show and taking a deeper look behind the scenes by focusing on the author. In April, we covered Solaris, which is a book written by Stanislav Lem, and we covered 2 film versions of it, one directed by Steven Soderbergh, which starred George Clooney, and another directed by Andrei Tarkovsky, which starred Donatas Banias, and I still probably pronouncing his name incorrectly. But Dole came back to us on that episode, Dole being the composer of our theme song, and he brought one of his new bandmates from his new project Theurgy along with him, his bandmate being Jackson, John Bomber. We recorded this one at a studio that John works at, Horstron Studios in Berwyn, Illinois. On these episodes, we got a solid triple 5-star review on the book, a somewhat obscure book that originally came out of Poland and was written and translated into easy prose, but was full of obscure, trippy, and thoughtful themes. With there being an older and newer adaptation from these directors, each putting their own take on the material, we really got to dig into how these adaptations can play out. Overall, neither of these films impressed us as much as the book, but the general consensus was that the older film was much more in line with what the book was about, even though the pacing might have seemed to drag that out. In May, we covered The Screwfly Solution, which is by Rokona Sheldon, a.k.a. James Tiptree, a.k.a. Al Sheldon. We also covered a Masters of Horror episode directed by Gremlins director Joe Dante, which starred Jason Priestley. This was a first on our podcast as we had 2 female guests, Amanda Andros and Erica Doyle, Erica being the wife of John Doyle, a.k.a. Dole. So this was a very interesting and tragic author to discuss, and we had a sort of classic Hollywood director with a lot of history too. We got into gender themes a bit as we tackled the disturbing sort of sci-fi horror tale that was presented, and it was enjoyable to bring it to my 2 guests who weren't necessarily big into the sci-fi genre. However, in this episode, we delved into the serious themes discussed in the book, but we also sort of laughed at the mostly unsuccessful campy take in the TV version. This was sort of an exemplary episode in our own discovering of a lesser-known gem that resulted in great conversation. It's kind of one of the things I most enjoyed about doing the podcast was finding these authors that were probably not as well known as they should have, maybe in modern times especially, or sometimes overlooked. Certainly there were audiences for them, but to then bring these to people who might have not previously been exposed to them and really find some neat stuff to get into and to unpack, and everyone really enjoying that. That was always one of the more fun things I enjoyed about this show. In June, we covered Sin City by Frank Miller, another graphic novel. We did a number of the yarns that make up that series, and we did the 2 movie versions that were directed by Robert Rodriguez, as well as Frank Miller, and starred Bruce Willis and Josh Brolin, among many others, in the star-studded casts. Wilk returned on this episode for a second time after his initial recording in Altered States, and he brought with him his friend Rob, who increased our comic book knowledge considerably. The 3 of us got to revisit and further explore this cult classic material while taking on a unique perspective of time, both in our own views and that of the director and writer. Another treat was trying to understand the unique collaboration that went into the movie, which kept true to the underlying source with varying success, that being the fact that Robert Rodriguez chose to bring in the comic book writer Frank Miller as sort of a co-director on these films. Plus, Wilk and Rob shared some fun anecdotes about their visit to Chicago and the true reason they came, which was to go see Pearl Jam. And in episode 7, in July, we covered Metropolis by Thea Van Arbu and the silent film directed by Fritz Lang, our first silent film that starred Alfred Abel. Beam came back for that episode, one of the original founding members of No Deodorant in Outer Space. He sort of came back kicking and screaming, as he turned out he wasn't overjoyed to be watching a silent film, but he did come back. And with him was my friend Rich Bacon, who's sort of a historian who added a lot to that perspective in these older works. We got a lot into history and the cultural perspective here, and the film itself had a life of its own, which is just as fascinating as its creation and place in history. We also struggled with the fact that this uniquely created duo source material was difficult to get through, yet we found a lot of depth in both the material and the historical and cultural context with which to find meaning from our modern vantage points. All this was set against the backdrop of a crackling bonfire on the edge of a soybean field with industry churning in the background. It was a perfect setting, and the excellent beer didn't hurt much either. In August, we covered Second Variety, coming back to our old friend Philip K. Dick. This was a short story by him. We touched a little bit on a sequel of sorts called John's World, and the film adaptation Screamers, which was directed by Christian Nguyen and starred Peter Weller. Rick was back on this episode, one of our co-hosts in previous seasons. It was just a duo episode on this one, just me and Rick, but that allowed us to delve pretty deep into the topic. This was an early story of the author that is kind of emblematic of what was to come from him later and what he would be more well known for. We also, talked about the film that resulted, which was admirable, if not successful. Rick kind of felt that the whole thing was more of the same from Philip K. Dick, but I myself enjoyed the insight into the author's developing voice, and it was a nice look forward by going backward. In the next month, in September, we covered The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle, as well as the animated rendition directed by famous directors Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass. This was another duo episode with returning book reviewer and my cousin Kaylin O'Reilly, where we got to talk about a young adult classic and the struggles of its author, along with a famous classic animation duo, those two directors being very well known for doing just classic Christmas animations that have been around for years. This seemingly lighthearted and sometimes humorous subject of The Last Unicorn was filled with subtle layers which facilitated as much conversation as the accomplished and legendary creators who worked diligently and collaboratively to prop it up. In October, we covered The Haunting of Hill House, written by Shirley Jackson, along with 3 visual adaptations, one by the director Robert Wise that starred Julie Harris, another one by Jean Dumont, which starred Liam Neeson, among others, and lastly, a Netflix adaptation by director Mike Flanagan, which starred Kate Siegel. This was another episode where the women outnumbered the men. Amanda Andros returned, as well as Laura Valley, Wilkes' wife. This was a fantastic mega review with a new miniseries version that came out for on-demand television right after our recording on the prior film versions. So this gave us a unique opportunity to revisit and really dig into the subject. We had a sort of all-star journeyman director, a lesser-known director, and an upcoming genre fan director. And each of these individuals took a different approach with the same subject, with varying regard to the original material and varying success, as our discussion evidenced. But there was just a great amount of enthusiasm in this episode. The quick prose by the author lent itself to just lots of exploration. We just had a lot of fun. And Laura and Amanda brought a lot. They were really into the material. In November, we had a real heavy hitter with 2001: A Space Odyssey, written by Arthur C. Clarke, along with the famous movie by director Stanley Kubrick, who we have previously covered when we did A Clockwork Orange. This was a late night and long recording session, but there was plenty of room to plumb the depths of this airy epic that spans through time, digging deep into history as it soars through space toward the future. We had lots of insights that were sometimes similar and sometimes came from different angles, but this was an old classic movie of which we were all already familiar, and it was excellent to pick up the book and glean new insights when we rewatched the movie. That is probably more poetry than the prose itself. And then to round out the season, in December, we covered Hogfather by Terry Pratchett, along with the BBC adaptation by Vadim Jean, which starred Michelle Dockery. We've covered Pratchett twice before, and on this episode, Rick came back for a second time, and joining him was his wife, Heather Mel. This episode was just bombastic. Rick returned, and Heather, who's a fan of Discworld herself, in a roundabout way as a result of the podcast, added a lot to the discussion. Terry Pratchett is an author always worthy of another look. His material was great as usual, but the sharp discussion and familiarity among our guests made this recording as whimsical and witty as the prose of its subject. It was a lot of fun. In looking back over the year and gleaning some commonality and differences of the varying topics we explored, it's probably worth noting that we delved into some feminist themes this season with covering James Tiptree Jr., who was a very interesting, female writer who adopted a male name and who had a difficult life, along with Shirley Jackson, who also had a difficult life. Both authors that were successful in their time and highly regarded, but might have got somewhat overlooked as the years went by, although not forgotten, and are sort of resurging in their own right, as both of them have awards in their own names that certainly keeps them visible, along with the works themselves. But in this season we also had at least these two episodes where the guests were all female, and they brought some new perspectives to reviewing these works. And sometimes we even looked into feminist aspects of the characters, as was evidenced in the Hogfather episode and some of the discussion between Rick and Heather and about the female protagonist. That was somewhat humorous, but we got into it there. Another thing I noticed in looking over the season was what I would loosely term as sparse prose. Some of the writers, their words were not so dense, but that led us to seemingly more discussion. Charles Beaumont, he was a quick writer. Frank Miller's, the graphic novels, obviously those were not very dense. Even The Last Unicorn, which was probably more poetic in its writing. All those things allowed us to get deeper into the material, seemingly. Or there were times where the prose was more weird and psychological, like in Second Variety. Philip K. Dick, you're always questioning things, people's motivations. Were they androids or not? Very classic PKD. Never Let Me Go was we thought a slow burn, the way it read, and all the speculative elements, the sci-fi elements of it, even though it was somewhat dystopian, but the technologies with cloning and stuff were very, very, very understated. We all kind of came into that thinking, certainly I did come into that thinking that it was going to be more in your face, more Hunger Games or something like that. And it was not. And yet, after we were done and during our discussion, after we were all done reading it and during our discussion, we found that there was a lot there to remember and reflect on. And the book really stuck with you. Same thing with Solaris, with just the weirdness going on there, with the alien ocean and trying to understand that, and just the originality of that plot. And yet that book was not dense. Or The Haunting of Hill House, Shirley Jackson's work, was not very long. The horror there was more psychological than it was supernatural, but the supernatural was there in its own subtle ways. And that wreaked terror while you read it. 2001: A Space Odyssey. The movie is probably more like that, although the book gets into some of it. You can contrast this against some of the more dense prose. Altered States was not a long book, and it was written by a very, very talented screenwriter who just pummeled us with his technical prose and that just did not go over well among our panel. Terry Pratchett, probably a more dense writer, but he uses satire. That was very much appreciated. The Screwfry Solution, that was an epistolary novel. That was more of a short story, then that went over well. I guess what I'm trying to say is even when the prose is not dense, somehow that space seems to open up your mind to the possibilities within the suggestions of the author's words. It really brokered our discussions, which was great. It was really great and facilitated the podcast that way. Another thing that kind of strikes me in looking back over the season is the unique collaborations that we saw. This podcast is about books turned into movies or short stories turned into movies or TV shows, whatever. Typically, the authors have no say in how that will play out because the contracts they sign don't allow them much. We've seen some things in the past where that's not necessarily the case, like with Clive Barker when he directed his movie of his book, which was very successful. But that's not often how things go. In this season, Never Let Me Go, the author had sort of a hands-off approach, and he seemed to be, from what I remember, pleased enough with the movie adaptation. In Solaris, that author wiped his hands from the filmic versions, and he didn't even see them, but he was negative about them even though he didn't even see them. Those were totally different reaction. some cases the author's deceased, like in the Screwfly solution, or in Second Variety, or the later versions of The Haunting. Although in the first version of The Haunting, they did go and consult with the author, and she gave them some insights that influenced the directorial decisions. There were reluctant authors. I kind of remember Peter S. Beagle was unsure about having, Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass direct the version of The Last Unicorn, although he wrote the screenplay for it. And in The Hogfather, Terry Pratchett was notorious for being very restrictive in licensing his work because he felt he didn't need the money, so he just really wanted something that he would like. So eventually he started working with the BBC, and he seemed to be pleased with how things turned out, even though Rick was surprised by that when we talked about it on the episode. Like I mentioned, sometimes the authors do have some input, like on The Haunting, the first version of it. Charles Beaumont was a writer that contributed a lot to the Twilight Zones. One would think he had some input in their adaptations, but I don't think we got too much or knew too much of how that played out. But there was opposites. There was opposites in the sense that where was these collaborations worked well or did not work well. Sin City was very unique. Frank Miller brought in Robert Rodriguez, and they seemed to get along and work together to bring a visual adaptation that was, the first one was very successful, the second one not as much, but that was a total collaborative effort. In Altered States, the author of the book wrote the screenplay and had been previously involved with films and won awards, as we talked about it. However, Ken Russell, a controversial director, was brought in, and they clashed big time. We talked about it on the episodes, and that author was not happy with what Ken Russell did, although we all probably liked the movie a lot better than we did the book. So even though the author didn't like what was going on, Ken Russell kind of did his own thing and was probably more successful with the material. We also covered a sort of unique experience in Metropolis and 2001: A Space Odyssey, where a book was written contemporaneously with the film. In Metropolis, the author and director were married at the time. The book was probably, in both cases, they were going to release the book first to kind of promote the movie, and it didn't always work out that way. But, they worked collaboratively to bring about the movie. Same thing with the Space Odyssey. Stanley Kubrick hired Arthur C. Clarke to work with him and come up with a treatment. And then they kind of went off in their own corners to start working on the separate aspects, occasionally reconsulting with each other. One could argue that at some point the director sort of takes over, but that was a different way of doing things than some of the others. It was interesting to see how those played out, and in how when those directors did go their own way and kind of shy away in the end from what the authors were doing, they might have made the works a little bit more successful than they otherwise would have been. We also covered 3 sort of epic and strange cult classic movies, with Metropolis, the silent film, the first Solaris movie, which is often compared to 2001: A Space Odyssey. These are all long movies where a lot of effort and detail was put into them, and in general they run slower, although Dole was arguing that 2001: A Space Odyssey moved much faster and more successfully than Solaris. Metropolis is a silence film. It's its own thing, and Beam was having trouble with that. But those were all kind of these big, sprawling movies. And one could say that those movies themselves were very poetic in the way they exhibited the material. In the case of 2001: A Space Odyssey, we had all seen that movie previously. But I think everyone would have agreed that reading the book brought some further clarity to a film that otherwise had some parts that were somewhat obscure or maybe left you thinking. And the book didn't always just provide a total explanation of things, but it helped probably form your thoughts more. We talked about that when we covered Metropolis, how you could really benefit in watching the movie, after you've seen the book. The same thing could probably be said for Solaris. It's not necessary, but if you're really into checking out those movies and you want the full experience, reading the book could really go hand in hand with dissecting the movie. Not that the book is the be-all, end-all authority. The director certainly chose to make their own decisions at certain points, but, the book complements the movie, and that was kind of a different experience in this season of the podcast. where does that leave things now for No Deodorant in Outer Space? Well, this is a goodbye episode. I announced at the beginning of the season that I had pre-recorded a full season of episodes because I thought it would be important to have that ready to go. I also thought that in pre-recording the episodes, which took about a year to do, that would give me a big jump start in getting things going since I was taking the helm myself. That didn't play out quite the way that I'd hoped, as the editing and producing of the podcast, along with the administrative work of releasing the episodes, it took up more time than I expected. And what happened was I started to stray away from my other interests, that being writing, which is what happened the last time when I was doing the podcast with the guys. So I've decided at this time to put that podcast back on hiatus to end things here. There's not going to be any more episodes. I'm not sure if there ever will be, but I'm not going to say there never will be. I just feel like at this point, if I want to do other things, that I have to put the podcast to the side. I really enjoyed it. It was really fun. It was fun to do things differently. It was really great to get new guests with new perspectives and to cover another wide variety of genre-related material. I had so much fun, and I find that I got so much more out of the books and movies that I read and watched by discussing it with people. It just made the experience of delving into these fantastic pieces of literature and film that much more enjoyable. And so I appreciate everyone's participation in this endeavor with me. Like I said, I wanted to thank everyone. But this is where things are going to lie for now, and possibly indefinitely. But I don't know. So the episodes are there for anyone to enjoy or not enjoy as they see fit. That's going to be it. The podcast is going to be back on hiatus, and I just wanted to let everyone know. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it. If anyone gives the podcast a chance, and, hopefully, like I always say, you might have learned a couple things along the way, and at the very least, you're able to laugh at our efforts. We try to get into things and discuss things and learn things, but sometimes we just get silly. But that's part of the fun. So, in the words of the immortal Bilbo Baggins, as written by J.R.R. Tolkien from The Fellowship of the Ring, who I've been parodying a bit in this episode. Now, at last, and thirdly, I regret to announce that, though as I said, 4 years is far too short a time to podcast among you, this is the end. I am going, I am leaving, now. Goodbye.
For more information on the topics discussed in this episode, or to read our show notes and find us on social media, visit nodeodorant.com. For more information on Ryan Sean O'Reilly and his various works of fiction, visit ryanseano'reilly.com. The theme music for this podcast was written by John Doyle from the band I Decline. You can visit him at i-decline.com. Voiceover for this podcast was provided by me, Margaret O'Reilly. Well, that concludes our episode. We hope you've learned a lot. Again, thanks for listening to our show. And always remember, there is no deodorant in outer space.